Okay, thanks everyone. Darren and I didn't discuss our presentations before we were here, but we are going to cover some same territory. This presentation I'm presenting on behalf of Peter Fairbrother and Kathy Brigden. I know Peter's online. I'm not sure whether Kathy's with us as well. Look, we're looking at how regions are undergoing transition. And in what way union confederations can draw together unions in these developments. And we can see some reasons as to already as to why this has happened. So the way that that I'll look at this today is just have a look at the regions. This builds on some work that's done previously, so we'll assess where we're up to and where we're going. Just for some context, this is the Gippsland region that Darren has already focused on. And you can see there we've got down the bottom left the smokestacks from the brown coal, kind of in the middle there's the forestry. It's also dairy. There's an established Trades and Labour Council. So in Australia, confederations are known as TLCs. This is the Gippsland TLC. And in the bottom right, bottom left again there's a fellow there, John Parker, who was a leader of the TLC until for most of the 2000s and up until he died in 2015. The other region we're looking at is Northwest and West Tasmania. You can see there mining in the top right, forestry bottom left, very similar terrain, but absence of a coordinated Trades and Labour Council and leadership there. And both these regions, because of their mining forestry backgrounds, are subject to very political, intense political economic debates, discussions about just transition. And we look at these regions because, well, the unions, the workers are going to have to move to somewhere, and we know that workers matter. So unions, the people, they live, they advocate, they participate in the build community in these regions. So really the puzzle for us that we want to address through these questions is how can these regions be part of socioeconomic development that is upon them? And we're going to look at these unions and their forms of experimentation to try and understand some of these questions. So we look at regions because they are important in Australia. They are economically important. They produce our food, they provide our wind, they provide brown coal, which we survive on. And they are also very complex places. So they are Australia has a history of frontier homicide. The British and the Europeans came in 200 years ago, completely displaced Aboriginal people who had used the resources and extracted from the soil and the water for sustainable living and community. Europeans come in and of course we start extraction in a capitalist form and we create the disaster that we're in right now. But also from that settlement by the European and the British, we have all these myths as well about the pioneers who came in and saved us, and they, by cutting down trees and building log cabins and, as I said, extracting the resources. So we have a sense of that hard work that has gone into these regions, and it's generational. So we're dealing with some social and political issues there as well. But underpinning all this is, in both of these regions and around Australia generally, is what we refer to as the foundational economies. So in Australia, we call these the social and care support sectors, or broadly the health sector. So it's the people that provide childcare, disability care, aged care, working in the hospital systems that are indeed the most in-demand workforces in these regions, and are the greatest numbers, but don't really fit into the myths of that pioneering process. When we look at these regions, we also need to look at their governance structures. So in Australia, we have a tripartite structure. We have a national federal government, we have a state or provincial, and then we have local or municipal level. And it's at that local level now, given neoliberalism, we talk about devolving the decision making to the community and the communities being part of what is happening to them. But in essence, where are those decisions being made, given that the state or the national or the federal government actually have the money, have the political connections, and either them or multinationals in Canada or in Europe are actually making decisions about what's happening to these communities. We also have a particular way that unions have operated in Australia that presents us some interesting questions. We have a very regulated, legislative-based industrial system from over 100 years ago, and that through various ways created some occupational and sectoral distinctions between men's work and women's work. And we also have these sort of, we call them awards, these contracts of employment are negotiated very, very structured ways. And we now do that in terms of enterprise bargaining, but the connection with the regions there is that we have confederations that are dealing with these transition issues, but also are operating within a very old and structured industrial relations system. So, you know, we're really thinking about how we can marry up these issues. The way we're approaching this is some fairly conventional methods. We're looking at comparative policy analysis, and this literature itself acknowledges that there are gaps in comparison at that micro level, at the regional industrial level, lots of stuff at national level, but not so at the micro level. So we're building on some data that was collected 10 years ago. We'll continue to do some qualitative analysis and look at the documents in the region. So this is another map of Gippsland. Lucky Darren and I didn't copy the same web page. So this gives you another sense of what we're talking about in this first Gippsland area. And you can see over, if I start from the far right there, you can see that's where the forestry is in East Gippsland. And then as you start to, well, go down there, you can see the oil and gas that Darren's already, there's wind farms there as well, but that's the same sort of region. And then further to the west, you have that little inset there where I put mining. That's Moe, and that's the town that Darren was also referring to. And that's the centre of trade unions, really. So you have this enormous expanse of Gippsland, but a lot of the unionism has been centred around those mining areas, whereas the forestry happens further across. And this is how Gippsland is defined in terms of, and how the Confederation defines itself. So, as I said, it's strongly unionised in the Gippsland area. There was one employer, the State Electricity Commission of Victoria, for about 80 years. And they created some towns, created mining towns, and then there was the process of privatisation. And during these processes, they actually just filled in some of these towns. And the quote there in the middle of that slide is a person who was born in that area and watched the hospital they were born in just get bulldozed and covered in sand. So there's a very transactional arrangement here for these workers. And of course, once we see mining closures, we see those knock-on effects to all other industries and the community in the region. And again, it's becoming far more political as we, as a community, engage in some of these climate change debates. So where are we with the trade unions, which is really the focus of our discussion? So for most of that period, there was just that centralised trade union representation for mining and forestry, and mining more so than forestry. And then in the early 2000s, this fellow, John Parker, who again is the middle fellow in that bottom photograph, comes in to lead the Trades and Labour Council and shifts to what he refers to as his own sense of a community unionism. So it's practical, isn't what perhaps academically we would say, but John's sense of being with the community, going out to farmers' days, hanging around the mall in a good way. Yeah, John liked to chisel a bit of wood, so he'd go with his knife and a bit of wood and then just sit in the farmers' days instead of a community event and do that and just be there and talk to people. And this was really quite interesting because the union then broadened to some of those foundational economy workers. So whereas the Trades and Labour Council right across that Gippsland region had really been focusing on that tiny area of Moe, in John's mind and in the way he approached his unionism, it was broadening the remit. But also, of course, there was always the just transition in the background because it was such an established mining and forestry area. And John created this Gippsland Industries in Transition conference and brought together communities in the early 2010s, brought together other businesses and organisations and communities in the region, which really was quite innovative. It was really, really innovative for that particular area. So there's some development then of some regional collectivism. So there's some coordination amongst the Trades and Labour Council and some deeper representation of the broader workforce. But then what happens in 2016 is with 6 months' notice, the largest power generator, there's an announcement that it's going to be shut. So that really, and it is in that little area that we've focused on in Moe, but it's enormous because it just has such an enormous impact on the labour market. We also have the forestry under threat. We're having conversation about transitioning to new jobs, and as I said, John dies in 2015, and then there's this move back to the Confederation being dominated again by the mining power unions, not the forestry, because they're out in the east. It's a fairly long drive if you've ever been to Australia, and the Trades and Labour Council has reconfigured. And there are 8 people on there. There's one woman amongst those 8. She's in the public service. The other, and one of them is in the tertiary. One of the 8 is in the tertiary union in Victoria, and the other 6 are in the mining and power union. So again, we've just gone from this idea of, or this practice of community unionism and engaging people to really focusing back onto the mining, forestry, that just transition. And what we have is young people, of course, wanting to come back to their places of and live. Now, just quickly to the northwest and West Tasmania. I'm running out of time. I shouldn't do this to Tasmania because we always run out of time when we talk about Tasmania. If you've looked at a map of Australia, it's big, and then there's this tiny little dot down here, that's Tasmania. Anyway, similar industries, rather than brown coal, you can see the old, or the photograph down the bottom left there is hydroelectricity. When we come to the Trades and Labour Councils there were, if you can see, Burnie and Devonport with the green circles around them in that west part of Tasmania. And you can see Hobart down the bottom southeast there. So there were Trades and Labour Councils in Burnie and Devonport. There was some shenanigans, some contests. They collapsed. They were rebuilt again in the 80s, and they are now, there's only one Unions Tasmania, one Trades and Labour Council, and it's down in Hobart, which is that southeast, and it's also the capital of Tasmania. And you can see where about the middle of the state there, I've put a green dotted line. There's about 300 kilometres between Devonport and Hobart, which in Tasmania is a long way. In the rest of the country, it's where you drive to go and get a you know, a bottle of beer on a Saturday afternoon and drive home again. Well, at least where I come from in WA, but that's another story. But there is also this north-south. People don't go between the two. So we have a confederation that's located in the south of the state, trying to connect with people that are in the north of the state. And this very quickly is Smithton. It was McCain's, who's obviously a Canadian company. They took over a vegetable processing plant there. The factory was very unionised. They announced a closure. The union individually wrote to the McCain family and said, "Can you not do this?" There was no answer. The McCain family were offshoring to New Zealand, which is another little country, a couple of islands over there. It's only about 2.5 hours flight, but you need a passport if you go there from Australia. They wrote to them, and there was nice dialogue between the two unions, but nothing eventuated. Also, Tasmania is known for its, it has some national United Nations heritage listing for its forests, and there's some real tensions between unions and workers and political groups around the forestry and around the mining. So what we find in the Tasmanian example is a less coordinated approach than we had in the Gippsland example. So what does this tell us? So both regions are disadvantaged. Gippsland in relation to the rest of Victoria, Northwest and West Tasmania, not only in relation to Tasmania, but the whole of the state. That area is one of the most disadvantaged places in the country. So we have, we know that there's not a great deal of comparative literature of unions and confederations operating in this field in the literature, so we've got our comparative approach to that. We know that the Gippsland Trades and Labour Council grew out of that mining industry. They unevenly represented a particular group of people. Can they shift? And we know that Tasmania is, the Trades and Labour Council down the south is perhaps representing everyone. Is that really the question? So what we want to know is how can, what resources do unions need to engage in these local government areas? How can unions experiment to change their forms of representation? And what sort of leadership do they need? And we can see in the top left here, that's our Michelle O'Neill, the head of our Australian Confederation. There's a little bit of Australian flora and fauna there as well. Look at this. But thank you.